In almost all of Western society, the act of marrying a dead person, which can be referred to as posthumous marriage or necrogamy, is pretty strictly forbidden. And yet, not all cultures see eye to eye on this one. Forms of this practice have existed very sparsely in other countries and cultures, but today our focus is on China, a country where so-called Chinese ghost marriages, aka spirit marriages, aka netherworld marriages, are part of a tradition that's estimated to have already survived over 3,000 years. A practice most prevalent in rural areas of China, and one that locals consider to be very normal. A ghost marriage is defined more or less as a marriage in which one or both participants is deceased. Or, if you like it more bluntly, in China, you can marry dead people. If you're like a lot of people, I'm guessing your next question might be something along the lines of, why? Why would I marry a dead person? Other than maybe for affording one the luxury of a spouse who never complains or nags? Seriously, what in the world could be in it for me? This may surprise a lot of us, but there are actually, in fact, a whole handful of reasons, situations, or predicaments under which a person in China might desire a ghost marriage. I think that in order to truly understand the need and desire for ghost marriages, we first need to try to understand the mindset that precluded the whole idea in the first place. Perhaps an overly simplified way of looking at it might be to say that the living seek to marry off their dead loved ones so that they won't be single in the afterlife. But there's a little more to it than that. Historically, the Chinese people have for a long time placed a great deal of importance on the preservation of their lineage. They're also a culture that tends to make sure that their loved ones are taken care of, not only in the here and now, but also in the beyond. Something we can all probably relate to is actually that desire to have that reassurance that even after we're gone, we know that our kids are going to be okay. In Chinese culture, even now, the parents of both sons and daughters take an active role in helping their children get married off. And of course, in China, this is all cool. It's traditional and it's what's expected. Except, as we also all know, life isn't always predictable or fair. Try as we might to always ensure the safety and well-being of our children, sometimes things happen that are simply out of our hands. In China, a parent might find themselves in a pretty bad spot in cases where their child is taken away from the world, via accident, illness, etc., before the child is able, for whatever reason, to settle down, marry, and procreate. Because here's the problem with all of us if you live in China. Considering all the pressure put upon the people of China to marry and have kids, you can imagine that the pressure to wed becomes extraordinarily huge. In fact, it becomes so huge that for traditionalists, marriage isn't exactly viewed as something optional so much as it's seen as one's duty or obligation. In light of that, an individual who passes away before they are able to marry, bear children, and essentially fulfill their duty of preserving the family lineage is now, for all intents and purposes, regarded, or should I say, disregarded as worthless. Several millennia later, these beliefs persist, and a person who dies, even by no fault of their own, having never been married, is considered but an embarrassment to the family. For anyone brought up with Western views, it's probably really hard to understand how a person's family could ever shame them simply for the act of dying young. But apparently, in parts of China, the act is more or less an abomination. The surviving family members are left in a very undesirable position. So what, if anything, does one do if they find themselves in this kind of a predicament? In China, this kind of an unfortunate situation still has hope of being remedied by none other than a spirit marriage, a ghost marriage, or what have you. Ultimately, we can clearly see now that ghost marriages aren't something that the people of China engage in as some sort of an enjoyable pastime. Rather, it seems like it's a ritual that happened to arise out of necessity in times when people found themselves in what they otherwise considered to be desperate circumstances. Although in unusual circumstances, it may be children arranging spirit marriages for their own parents, in the vast majority of cases, it's a parent that's playing matchmaker to a dearly departed child. One scenario that might be considered ideal for a ghost marriage is an occasion where daughter passes away unexpectedly and unwed. Subsequently, the surviving parents may offer money to any man willing to take their daughter's hand in marriage. It is said that quite often, the man who accepts this kind of a proposition is a man of lower socioeconomic status who is said to be tempted by the money. On some occasions, it's said that the money is placed into a red envelope and dropped on or near a walkway. Tourists who come to China have been warned against picking up red envelopes should they happen to spot one on the ground. According to tradition, the male that picks up said envelope agrees to wed the deceased young woman in exchange for the money that is enclosed inside the envelope. Such acts of bribery or even trickery only go towards showing that often trying to find somebody willing to marry your deceased child isn't always easy. Luckily, parents have alternatives in cases where they can't or prefer not to play matchmaker. Some elect to hand it over to their priests, while others turn to actual agencies that have been set up for this precise type of service. In exchange for pretty penny, families can usually at least rest assured that their passed away loved one will be able to rest in peace. With that said, what's another reason someone might seek out a ghost marriage? Well, in China, it's seen as traditional and pretty important that in the case of two brothers within one family, the older of the two, or oldest in the event there should be three, get married first. But what happens when life doesn't go that way? What if the older brother just finds himself unlucky in love and his younger brother happens to fall in love and gets engaged first? Once again, here's a situation wherein ghost marriage might be seen as the best solution. And just in case you're sitting there thinking, wait a minute, doesn't China have a one-child policy? Well, on January 1st, 2016, China actually dropped their one-child policy in favor of a two-child policy. This changed once again with the government instating a three-child policy only relatively recently in 2021. If you think all the way back to the beginning of this video, you might remember that I defined Chinese ghost marriage as a marriage in which one or both parties are deceased. Under what terms might two families see fit that their deceased children, let's say, get married? In one specific case, there was a young man we'll just call Lee who passed away from leukemia before his time. In order to appease the ancestors, please the living, and adhere to tradition, Lee's mother would subsequently embark on the quest of finding her son a ghost bride. In other words, this wedding would take place between two deceased individuals. Except that when Lee's mother found the perfect match for her son, that bride wasn't yet deceased. Rather, she was hours away from dying from kidney failure. What may seem to some like an unconventional, possibly even quite callous solution was for both this bride and groom's families the cause for much relief and elation. The couple, who had never met while alive, were wed the following day in a wedding funeral hybrid style ceremony. First there would be the more joyous ceremony, after which the couple would swiftly be buried together in a family grave. Were it not for this last-minute union, Lee may not have been allowed to be buried with the rest of his family, given the belief that passing away without having yet continued the family bloodline makes a person unworthy of being laid to rest alongside his ancestors, as the Chinese believe their souls would have been forced to remain in a state of unrest. While sons are forbidden from being buried in the family grave, daughters who pass on in this situation are not allowed to be buried at all. As for the wedding ceremonies themselves, they are perhaps surprisingly referred to as not really that much different from any other average wedding ceremony. Sound hard to believe? According to the people of China, at a typical ghost wedding you'll see mostly similarities. Guests attend bringing flowers and gifts and money, and the bride and the groom are wed by an ordained holy man in front of an altar. Consider a situation wherein a living man and a woman are engaged to be married, but where, let's just say, the wife-to-be dies suddenly and unexpectedly in some kind of an unforeseeable accident. Here's yet another situation where a ghost marriage might be seen as prudent. The wedding will likely be performed right away. The bride's body will actually be present at the ceremony, seeing that the death has just recently occurred. In these cases, the body of the deceased individual is brought in to lie on the altar next to the groom. In the event where either one or both of the parties to be wed have been deceased for a significant amount of time, in that case, effigies will be used to represent the individual, be they the bride, the groom, or in some cases both. Following the wedding, the effigy or effigies are burnt in the ritualistic funeral ceremony that follows. At this point, should one of the newlyweds be alive, it's said that the person, usually male, has the option not to witness the aforementioned cremation if that's what they choose. This can't be concluded without a mention of what some might cite as a pretty enormous downside to the practice being conducted in our modern times today. Perhaps somewhat predictably, a low supply of female brides coupled with a disproportionately high demand for such brides in China has created a rather dangerous black market for ghost brides, aka female bodies. Quite disturbingly, the news of a young woman dying at certain given local hospitals will sometimes create a frenzy known as an auction war among anyone in the market for a ghost bride. Such auctions are, by the way, usually completed before the young sick woman has even passed away. And what is the going rate for a ghost bride anyway? In 2016, it's estimated that the average cost of purchasing a bride was typically around what would be equal to roughly 31,000 United States dollars. But not everyone can afford such exorbitant costs, and we already mentioned that the demand is high, which further works to drive the costs up even higher, hence the emergence of the black market. Specifically, all of this has resulted in rampant grave robbing, but also in kidnapping and even murder. The young women often targeted for such kidnappings and murders are handicapped women. What fuels this is the fact that once again, purchasing a bride via the black market may be more appealing, considering that such brides are sold for a mere fraction of the cost that one would have to pay to win a bride at, let's say, an auction. In spite of the rampancy of grave robbing and the rise of kidnapping and murder, at the time of this taping, while the Chinese government do punish those who desecrate or rob graves with prison sentences of up to 3 years, still no regulation exists to outlaw the actual buying and selling of corpses, nor is there any regulation in place to forbid the practice of ghost marriages. Oh, and just for the record, this isn't at all a hidden practice. Nobody hides their participation in ghost marriages, most likely because they know they don't have to. Even though the Chinese government has vocalized support for socialism over sorcery, as they refer to the ancient practice of spirit marriage, they have not taken steps to enact any laws that would prohibit such practices as previously mentioned. As far as why they have yet to do anything about the situation, a representative from one town's Department of Civil Affairs sums up their position rather simply. In the words of this representative, quote, "It is a long and slow process to remove tradition," end quote.
我紧紧想知道